The United States just imposed a 50% tariff on Canadian aluminum. Global News, June 2025. Within 48 hours, nearly 3 million tons of aluminum vanished from U.S. contracts. S&P Global. Panic gripped American manufacturers as supply lines crumbled. Price shocks rippled through auto, defense, and aerospace sectors. Meanwhile, Canada doubled down, retaliating with its own $29.8 billion in tariffs and rewriting the trade map to bypass the U.S. entirely. For decades, the aluminum trade symbolized trust between neighbors. Now, it's a battlefield. Why would one of the world's most stable trade partnerships unravel this fast, and who stands to gain from the fallout? For decades, the aluminum trade between the United States and Canada wasn't just a pillar of North American manufacturing, it was a symbol of reliability. Under NAFTA and later the USMCA, or CUSMA in Canada, cross-border flows of raw materials like aluminum moved with minimal friction. Canada, with its abundant hydroelectric power and stable regulatory environment, became the U.S.'s #1 aluminum supplier, meeting over 60% of its demand. Automakers in Michigan, aerospace contractors in Alabama, and even the Pentagon relied on Canadian aluminum as a foundational input. The system worked, smooth, predictable, quiet, but no relationship stays static forever. Signs of strain began as early as 2018, when the Trump administration first invoked Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act to impose tariffs on steel and aluminum, citing national security. Although Canada initially received a temporary exemption, it was soon lifted, sparking outrage from Ottawa. That episode ended with a truce and a tariff rollback in 2019, but the precedent had been set. Trade could be weaponized. By early 2025, with Donald Trump back in office and trade hawks emboldened, those tensions reignited, this time with far less subtlety. Citing foreign dumping and unfair subsidization, the U.S. reimposed a sweeping 25% tariff on Canadian aluminum in March. Within weeks, the tariff ballooned to 50% on key categories, triggering alarm across both borders. For Canada, this wasn't just economic, it was existential. Aluminum is one of its most strategically important exports, underpinning entire communities from Quebec to British Columbia. For the U.S., it was a gamble to assert control over a global supply chain unraveling under geopolitical stress. The fracture had begun, and this time it wasn't just a policy dispute, it was a structural shift with ripple effects still expanding. The U.S. action triggering the trade earthquake. On March 12, 2025, President Donald Trump stood at a podium in Pittsburgh and announced what he called a necessary step to defend American industry: a 25% tariff on all imported aluminum and steel, including those from longtime allies like Canada. Flanked by steel executives and flaring American flags, he invoked Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, a national security clause that had previously been used in 2018. If we can't protect our metals, we can't protect our nation, he declared. But there was a key difference this time: no exemptions. Canada, which supplied over 60% of the U.S.'s raw aluminum needs, used in everything from Ford F-150 frames to Lockheed Martin's jet fuselages, was now treated the same as geopolitical rivals. And it wasn't long before the tariffs were increased again. On June 4th, 2025, amid political pressure and election year posturing, the administration announced a second round of hikes, a 50% tariff on select categories of aluminum, including unwrought billets and alloy sheets, components critical to North American manufacturing. The move blindsided the market. Within 48 hours, multiple reports emerged of canceled aluminum contracts between U.S. buyers and Canadian suppliers. Analysts from S&P Global estimated that up to 3 million metric tons of aluminum were pulled from U.S. order books overnight. Prices for domestic aluminum spiked over 28% in a week, triggering panic in key sectors like aerospace, construction, beverage canning, and particularly automotive, an industry already strained by EV supply chain disruptions. Meanwhile, the US government justified the move as a strategic decoupling from foreign dependencies, but industry groups weren't convinced. The American Aluminum Association issued a rare public rebuke. This tariff doesn't punish bad actors. It penalizes our closest trade partner and threatens thousands of downstream jobs. Behind closed doors, defense contractors and automakers scrambled to find alternate suppliers. But global options were limited. Countries like China and Russia, major producers, were either under sanction or deemed unreliable. That left a vacuum the US couldn't fill alone. To the administration's base, the move looked strong, but to manufacturers and economists, it was a self-inflicted supply chain wound at a time when resilience, not restriction, was needed. The Canadian response: retaliation and realignment. Canada didn't wait long to respond. Just one day after the initial March announcement, Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland stood before the Canadian Parliament and unveiled a 29.8 billion Canadian dollars retaliatory package. This included a 25% tariff on imported US steel, aluminum, and dozens of other goods, from industrial equipment to ketchup. The list was surgical, hitting not just American exports, but also politically sensitive districts in key US states. This is not just about trade, Freeland said. It's about principle. When you attack our industries under the guise of security, you attack our sovereignty. But Ottawa didn't stop at tariffs. By late March 2025, Canada began rolling out a series of industrial rescue measures aimed at shielding domestic producers from the fallout. Government officials announced direct support packages for aluminum giants like Rio Tinto Alcan and Aluminerie Alouette. These included loan guarantees, infrastructure grants, and procurement preferences under an amended CUSMA framework. Simultaneously, Canada enacted new procurement rules. Federal and provincial agencies were now required to prioritize domestic metals or those from countries with reciprocal trade privileges. The move effectively excluded US suppliers from multiple Canadian infrastructure contracts: hospitals, railways, clean energy. Behind the scenes, Canada's logistics strategy also shifted dramatically. Recognizing its historical over-reliance on US ports for transatlantic and trans-Pacific shipments, Ottawa fast-tracked multi-billion-dollar upgrades to key corridors: Port of Prince Rupert, Port of Halifax, and inland rail networks. These expansions aim to create a bypass loop, allowing Canadian metals and goods to reach Europe and Asia without ever touching US soil, cutting logistical costs by an estimated 18%, according to S&P Global. Even more consequential was the international response. Countries like Japan, Germany, and Singapore, wary of US trade volatility, quietly shifted their sourcing strategies. Canadian aluminum began to replace American suppliers in contracts once assumed stable, especially in sectors requiring long-term reliability like aviation and renewable energy. What emerged wasn't just a retaliation, it was a realignment. Canada wasn't just hitting back, it was building something new. A trade posture more autonomous, more resilient, and increasingly favored by global partners, spooked by Washington's unpredictability. The stalemate: no exit, no winners. By July 2025, the US-Canada aluminum dispute had settled into a tense standoff, a cold economic war with no clear off-ramp. The US administration, buoyed by populist rhetoric, remained entrenched. Any attempt to scale back the tariffs risked looking weak before a critical election season. Meanwhile, the Canadian government, backed by bipartisan consensus and surging nationalist sentiment, had little political room to compromise. Worse, the diplomatic channels were gridlocked. Trade negotiators met multiple times throughout May and June, but sources confirmed to Reuters that talks had collapsed over mutual distrust and domestic pressure. What once was a technical trade disagreement had evolved into a strategic divergence, not just over aluminum, but over values: nationalism versus integration, short-term leverage versus long-term resilience. Industry leaders on both sides were left in limbo. American manufacturers called for urgent tariff relief. Canadian exporters reoriented toward Asia and Europe. No side wanted to blink first, and every day the standoff dragged on. Supply chains fractured further, and costs mounted financially, politically, and reputationally. North America's most trusted trade corridor now looked fractured, symbolically and structurally, and neither Washington nor Ottawa seemed ready or willing to make the first move toward repair. Impact on Canada, a company town on the brink. In the town of Saguenay, Quebec, aluminum isn't just an industry, it's an identity. For generations, this riverside community has revolved around Rio Tinto Alcan Smelter, one of Canada's oldest and largest aluminum production facilities. The plant employs over 1,500 workers directly and supports thousands more through transportation, housing, and small businesses that depend on its operations. When the U.S. slapped a 50% tariff on Canadian aluminum in mid-2025, the shockwaves hit Saguenay like a steel-toed boot. At first, residents hoped it would blow over, like in 2018, but this time was different. By July, U.S. orders had dropped nearly 45%, according to Rio Tinto's internal shipping logs. The company scrambled to redirect output to Europe and Japan, but infrastructure and contracts couldn't be reconfigured overnight. Layoffs soon followed. By late July, over 400 jobs were suspended, and many local suppliers, machining shops, catering companies, even the corner gas station, saw revenues nosedive. Mayor Julie Dufour called it a rolling economic emergency, noting that property tax revenues fell by 12% in just one quarter. In response, the federal government fast-tracked a $500 million Canadian stabilization package, offering wage subsidies and export transition grants. But residents say the damage runs deeper. It's not just jobs, it's our dignity, said Marcel Gauthier, a second-generation smelter worker whose son was recently laid off. We built this town on aluminum. Now it feels like we're being punished for someone else's politics. Nationally, the Canadian Aluminum Association reported a 9.7% drop in total exports to the U.S. between March and June, with an estimated 1.2 billion Canadian dollars in lost sales. The long-term concern is structural. As Canadian producers pivot to new markets, North America's once synchronized aluminum ecosystem may be permanently altered. And for towns like Saguenay, there's no quick fix, only the slow, uncertain process of economic adaptation. Blowback on the U.S., the auto industry's aluminum hangover. While the tariffs were sold as a protectionist win for American workers, many U.S. businesses were left scrambling to survive the fallout, especially in the auto sector. Nowhere was this more apparent than in Dearborn, Michigan, home to Ford Motor Company's headquarters and one of its largest assembly lines. The facility, which produces the best-selling Ford F-150, relies heavily on high-grade Canadian aluminum to meet fuel efficiency standards and weight reduction goals for trucks and EVs alike. When the 50% tariff hit, Ford's procurement team was blindsided. With supply suddenly constrained and prices skyrocketing, the company was forced to buy aluminum at a 28 to 35% premium from U.S. sources or less reliable international suppliers. According to an internal memo leaked to Automotive News, production costs per vehicle jumped by $1,450, triggering a temporary production slowdown and intensifying cost pressures on our EV line. The ripple effects didn't stop there. Downstream suppliers in Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky, many of which stamp, press, or mold aluminum into car parts, reported project cancellations and reduced shifts. A plant in Bowling Green laid off 90 workers in June, citing aluminum volatility. Meanwhile, American consumers started to feel it too. By July, the average price of a new vehicle had risen by 3.2%. With analysts directly attributing at least a third of that increase to metal costs. In a year already marked by inflation anxiety, the aluminum tariff became another pressure point for families trying to afford transportation. Critics argue the policy was self-defeating. "We're taxing our own supply chain," said John Bozzella, president of the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. "This doesn't make us stronger. It makes us slower, more expensive, and less competitive globally. Perhaps most ironic is this. Even as US producers ramped up smelting, their output only filled a fraction of the supply gap, and quality consistency remained an issue. For an industry built on precision, delays and quality rejections mounted. In the race to bring jobs home, America may have driven itself straight into a wall of unintended consequences. North America now stands at a critical inflection point. The aluminum dispute has become more than a tariff war. It's a test of trust between two of the world's most integrated economies. For decades, the US and Canada built a supply chain rooted in proximity, predictability, and shared purpose. But that foundation is cracking. American manufacturers are bleeding costs. Canadian workers are losing livelihoods. Political leaders on both sides dig deeper into their corners, leaving industries and communities caught in the middle. No one's winning. Not yet. The question isn't just about aluminum anymore. It's about what kind of future the continent wants to build, fractured or united, fragile or resilient. In the race to define that future, will North America win together or lose everything trying to go it alone? You're American or Canadian? What's your take? Share your story and your view in the comments below.